I'm going to turn it over to Dana now and Ava, who are going to moderate the discussion about the model requirements. Does that work for you?
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask Rory and Megan to come up here. I'm going to get you some chairs so that you can answer the questions.
While these guys get started, how many have you had a project with some sort of execution plan? All right. So not even half. Okay. Well, that's great. You guys are here today so that we can talk more about them, and hopefully you guys got a great understanding. They did a wonderful job explaining why they're important and why we do it. So I guess the first question would be creation of the BIM execution plan or the VDC execution plan. When does this happen? Does it happen at the award of the project? Does it happen before you get in Revit? You know, who creates it? Is it the model manager?
We have a template one that I bring to the table whenever we have a project kickoff internally. And so I tend to be called to initiate models because I like to have that control. Not that I have to, but it just makes it so that I know where the problems come from if I'm the one who started it, right? So since I'm involved with the initiation, I always come with it in hand. And I tend to develop it until, usually it's one of the younger project modelers that say, oh my God, you've been documenting this, thank you. And then they take it over. And so then they have this whole template that basically the plan that I've developed is just to structure the conversation. You're like, all right, who's going to manage the RCP? How did we do it in the past? You look at the BIM execution plan, you're like, oh, at some point in time, the mechanical engineer is supposed to be providing me a coordination view that I can link in. I should ask them about this. And so it just kind of leads the younger staff through the conversation of getting the views developed more effectively. So I usually start it.
Same question with you.
Yeah, so traditionally it had been, sorry.
Yeah.
Traditionally it had been the VDC execution plan was the first thing that the team wanted, and that would be their first request of, hey, we're going to do coordination on this project. We've got to have the VDC execution plan right now. But the problem with that is they're wanting it a little too early when we don't have all of the partners on board, and so we're trying to develop a lot of this stuff and put it out in contracts and then half the important key stakeholders are involved, right? So we have defined a better process now where the VDC execution plan is actually one of the later steps, and it's more focused on that initial alignment discussion and having that documentation. And we've kind of developed then and split the plan into a couple different sections, but having just sort of a base plan that can be installed early, and that's like a 6-page document or something that has some high-level goals and things like that, but doesn't get into the specifics on authoring software, naming conventions, or that fun stuff that we can figure out later. But then provides something that can go in the contracts for generic requirements, but puts the onus on the rest of the team to figure it out later collaboratively.
Awesome. And so you mentioned a BIM kickoff meeting, which is obviously a very awesome thing that everybody should do. But who would you say would be part of that? Would it be the entire team at that moment? And then once the team is added to, how do you let them know, like, hey, there's this wonderful document that I created for you?
Hey. I think it depends on how the project is contracted from the beginning. If you were doing an IPD project or the contractor was involved in more of a design assist scenario, you would definitely be including them earlier in your meetings. So there isn't one solitary kickoff meeting. We have an internal one where we just get our ducks in a row, like, all right, here's our project team. We got Shannon as the main modeler. We got Derek as the project architect, Steve is the principal in charge, yada, yada. And we start the model and we start talking about linking structures. And usually the linking structure discussion lasts for quite a few meetings. But then you would have a kickoff with your consultants, and then you'd have another kickoff with the contractor, if not the consultants and the contractor at once, depending on how it was contracted.
Yeah, I mean that's the only way, really the only way that you have to do it, right? Is there's different steps, the internal one, and then as everybody comes on, having more and more, and then sort of like the official one or whatever, once everybody is there and saying, okay, this is where we at up to this point and where we need to get to.
Great. So this question is a good segue from where we're just coming from, and it's specifically with a lot of owners more having their own templates that they start with, and we internally have developed our own. It sometimes forces us to develop them earlier on. It can sometimes cause confusions. Sometimes owners have requirements that they're not aware of. Can you talk about some challenges and successes that you've had when dealing with owner-directed templates, and how those have kind of played out? Because I know that we're doing it a lot with our company. I'm sure you are as well.
So we have 2 separate clients that come to us with their own templates, and we've now done a few projects with each client, so we know the template's idiosyncrasies. I always find it interesting to open up another person's template to see what decisions they made, because sometimes they're really good, and you're like, "Oh, I'm totally going to do that," and other times you're like, "Oh, that's how they did that." But there's definitely a getting to know of the other template. We had one title block that we couldn't figure out how they were getting the revisions scheduled. And they had built their own parameters, and they had done a very elaborate job of doing what Revit can do very simply. So every time I'm getting to know a new template, I always come back to just do it simply. And it's so much easier. But you definitely have to get to know another person's template when you have to absorb it into your workflow.
Yeah, that's what we try to do is take those requirements and incorporate it into our own, and then still use ours as the actual document, but explain to the client of where it aligns with their expectations. And then when they do have some crazy requirements, maybe trying to explain to them why that's not the best idea, or how it could be done better. And I think that's the important piece, right, of just aligning with them and making sure that we are meeting their expectations, regardless of whose plan it is. Doesn't really matter.
And Roy, you talked about a couple of instances that DPR had developed some things internally, like separate entities. Have you guys developed any software for either developing or a mechanism for checking that you're using, or proprietary things that you've decided are good for the development and checking in the BIM process?
Do you mean for checking the models?
There's something called LOD Planner.
Sure, okay.
And sometimes there's like Filippi, for example.
Right.
Are there any things that either of you are using just that you've decided are good tools as a part of either just like the error checking or the development of the PXP?
Sure. Not really, that we've really developed. I mean, we have some other tools, but not necessarily along those lines for doing that. I mean, we have, trying to think of some of the names, but nothing really comes to mind with regards to the checking. I mean, we're relying on existing software that's out there. We don't use Filippi as much. Our European office relies on it heavily, because I guess that market focuses on Filippi, or relies on it a good bit. But I mean, some other tools that we're getting involved with, a plugin for Navisworks called BIMtrack. And we use that throughout the design process to collaboratively identify issues with the design team and help to, that's a way for us to provide some constructability type feedbacks and to work, especially on projects with design assist partners. But hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah. So we've all, hopefully, if we've heard about a question.
No, I just had a question. You talked about earlier, Rory. You said that you don't really require LOD from your installers. I thought that was kind of curious, because it used to be the other way around. So can you talk to how that kind of happened?
Yeah, so we still do it, and we still have it, but it's more general terms, so LOD 1 through 400, with understanding that trade partners LOD 400 is fabrication level, right? And then we'll define what each of those are at a certain stage. But we don't go into the fine details of what LOD 300 means for each particular item, because that just gets so into the weeds and nobody ever follows it, and nobody, if we had a template that would set it up, and we've actually explored LOD Planner, but there's been some resistance because we're moving in the other direction. So we try to keep it more generic, and then thinking about the digital twin and that you should be modeling everything that you're installing, then keeping that, having more of that mindset rather than, okay, I have to take this particular element or piece of the model to this level, and that's my obligation.
Mm-hmm.
But
And Megan, how's that manifested in your world?
I am delighted to hear that. I feel like in some ways there was a bit of the tail wagging the dog with a lot of how BIM has been developed in the industry of, oh, we got to get all this organized, let's get really intense about the terms of LOD. Mm-hmm. And when you get down to, like when we turn a model over to you guys, and I'm starting to even not like the turnover, because it means like we wash our hands of it, and we just totally don't,
mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Like our LODs, they're standard. Like we have an LOD matrix that I show people whenever I'm introducing them to our standards, and it's like, yeah, casework is at LOD 200. They're like, what does that mean? It means use the families that we have in our library and you're fine, right? So like it doesn't even really resonate that heavily. Level of detail resonates heavily with the architecture side. Engineering has its own challenges, and I'm not an engineer, so I can speak to them generally, but I'm not going to speak to them right now. But the level of detail that we have to put into our renderings, you know, with Inkscape, we can produce great renderings out of our Revit model. But that means we have to put a lot of detail in there. And some of that detail might be faked to make the Inkscape model resonate emotionally with our client for them to buy into the project. But if we turn that over to the contractor and you guys are supposed to build exactly from that, there's a disconnect there.
Yeah. And how about you, Dana and Ava? Is LOD a big part of? No, it's not.
Yeah, I would agree with what
Could you use
Roy
the
was
mic,
saying.
please? We're trying to record this.
Yeah, I would agree with Roy in that our philosophy typically is if you don't model it, you don't own the installation area in the field. So if you choose not to and you somehow get lucky, that's great. But if it's not in the model, you're going to pay for it in the field. So an LOD is a good way to plan for that in a collaborative process. But in terms of how we deal with it as contractors, it's definitely like if you choose not to model even your connection, that's something that you kind of have to deal with the ramifications later if we're trying to understand who needs to pay to move what. So, yeah.
So LOD, level of detail and level of development. How about LOA, level of accuracy? Especially Megan, you mentioned that you work with existing conditions, whether those are outsourced or received from the client or what have you. Is there a different process when you're actually working with an existing condition?
Very much so. We invented this term called the U wall. U, the letter U, right? Because it's an unknown wall. Because you get your AutoCAD plans, you have two lines, and they're 4 inches and 4 inches and 5/8 inches thick. So you can assume what it is, but you don't really know what it is, right? And if it's 12 inches, that could be a hay bale wall. Like you just don't know. Anybody who's done renovation work in a hospital, you take down a wall, you have no idea what you're going to get on the other side. And so we use the U wall in order to put into the model as few assumptions as possible. And so the level of accuracy, you always have to double check the dimensions, just like you did in the world of CAD, right? You just don't know what you've got out in the field compared to what you have drawn. But the more you start to make assumptions when you're modeling existing conditions, the more the model becomes less and less reliable. And if you continue to always keep the assumptions at bay and you always are very factual with your data in terms of, I don't know what this wall is, but I know those 2 lines that I got from my client were 4 and 5/8 inches apart, then the model becomes really reliable. As far as level of accuracy, I mean, anybody who's gone through a pre-construction phase knows how quickly things can get shifted. So I don't really know how to speak to that one right now.
Well,
It's a messy
there
world.
actually is an LOA matrix.
Is there?
It is specific to as-built conditions.
Okay.
In particular, if you are going to have it contracted out, or if an architecture firm were going to be awarded a job where they're modeling as-built conditions. And it actually does verify for how many times you've checked.
Interesting.
Whether that's through scanning or actually physically checking the model. So, you know, just another thing to throw in there to
Yeah.
the pot.
So while we're on the subject matter of anything level of objects, I did want to, when Dan and I were talking about this presentation, both she and I agreed on the challenges with existing conditions and what it really means to connect into projects and who's responsible for those, because the contractor's responsible for building into it, but the designers are responsible for detailing it. So can either both of you speak to some of lessons learned, challenges, how they've been addressed in the execution plan in terms of strategy about those elements?
Yeah, for us, capturing existing conditions really comes down to laser scanning or detailed field investigations. I mean, we've been burned so many times with existing conditions that weren't captured and had this beautifully coordinated model, but yet there's structural elements that nobody knew about before the ceilings were opened up that completely threw that off and made coordination useless. So, I mean, we put that in for it's an existing building, regardless of, you know, if the architect if they did it, then excuse me, great. But oftentimes things move so fast that they haven't had the opportunity to. So we'll always offer the service, and at least we'll scan it and compare it to design models and say, here's discrepancies we found, and either the architect will make the change or we'll make the change, or at least use the point cloud as consideration for our coordination. And then the trades update it in their as-builts. I think
What's your preference?
Preference?
In terms of who updates it? Because
Sure.
that's a challenge. I know that we have, because it's like once we find that there's discrepancies, it's
Right.
like, well, how do we document to build from?
Right.
Just to give you a little bit of a basis also, I'm an architect and she's a contractor, so we like to mimic what was going on here.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, I think the design team would update their models based on that.
I would agree.
It doesn't always work like that. So.
Doesn't always work like that. You got to get paid to work.
Right.
Yep.
Is it okay to ask a question? Hey everybody, sorry about that. Yeah, it was great conversation, great presenters. But on the actual idea, I'm a structural engineer background, BIM manager as well as project manager. And so we do a lot of times for heavy industrial clients, pretty complex existing conditions that even have some difficulties due to safe accessibility and construction.
Yeah.
I guess since we're talking both on the engineering and the construction side as well, and we're connecting it to the VDC Execution Plan, has anyone ever considered that with complex existing projects, does anyone leave room for undiscovered design changes that severely affect design time or construction document delivery time or project management time? Usually on the engineering side, unless we're fortunate to have a great architect, we get these unknown discoveries, and no matter what, we still have to meet that deadline. And you know, that could be a significant design challenge, and it's almost impossible. So have you guys addressed unknown changes early on in your execution plans or in your contracts?
We try to. I mean, at least put in some significant or sufficient time for discovery of some of those, and obviously there's going to be oftentimes things that are, you don't know what you don't know, right? But you know, I think the client, though, in a lot of cases is going to come back and say, well, you should have known. So it doesn't always work out, hey, we didn't know, but yeah, you got to have some contingencies built in some ways, and addressing that in the VDC execution plan, not so much outside of saying we know it's an existing facility, so we are going to laser scan and look for specific items too. I mean, and we have a lot of lessons learned too. Like we know that in older buildings that the steel joists are actually going to be sloped according to the roof drains, which we've been burned on before. Saurabh Chandarana here can tell you all about that. And then, you know, things like kickers that we know are going to be there, or if in this existing wall there's probably some support framing up there that wasn't accounted for. So we can, even if we don't know it's there or exactly what's there, we can even, we did it before, put in some no-fly zones or something like that to maybe stay away from that area since we don't know exactly what's there. Let's not put a bunch of stuff in there and have problems later.
Awesome, and I definitely want to encourage anyone to add to this discussion. Definitely want it to be a discussion. With that, so we often refer to the execution plan as a living document, right? It's ebbing and flowing with the project as it goes. So, is it, you know, one role of the person of the team to make those changes? How are those changes integrated? We mentioned that maybe we have some kind of intermediary kickoff meetings, you know, at different times of the project. How would you guys say you go about making changes to it, or even to your template when you go back and you get those lessons learned and you decide that you want to add some things?
In my role, because we're a small firm, I tend to be the sole person in charge of changing the template, which has its pluses and minuses. It's pretty intimidating to be that person at times, but the template is designed, as I said previously, to structure a conversation. So it's not there to tell you how to do everything, because design is messy, and supporting a client's needs and providing that service is a winding road, and you can't, you don't want your execution plan to impede on the design process. If a designer feels like the plan is forcing their hand in any kind of way, they will put it aside, because there's beautiful things about working with architects and horrible things. The beautiful thing is, you know, everyone's doing the best they can. There's not, I've never met a slacker architect, which has its benefits and its drawbacks, right? So you know everybody's going to do the best they can. So if you give them guidelines and boundaries of things to structure their conversation, they will use it. But if you stifle them, they will put it aside. And so they craft the execution plan basically by negatively editing the template. You know, they say, oh, we need to have a conversation of what our linking structure is. Here's 5 choices to start the conversation. Oh, we certainly don't want to do those 3. Just take them out. We'll talk about the other 2 next time. Yeah.
So some problems we've had with that concept of a living document is if it's, or traditionally the execution plan had been a contractual document, right? And so if you're making changes to that, then it needs to go through the proper channels in order to make those changes, right? So if you're halfway through the process and need to make an update to change your naming conventions or structure or something simple, you've got to, you know, technically go through the whole change order process to get that approved and have it signed off from every stakeholder, which is crazy. So, we've tried to move more away from, now that we know it is a living document, but anything contractual, take that out, put it in the contract. The execution plan itself is not a contractual document, but more of the plan that we can make changes to, and as long as we're in agreement, and we've had sign-off sheets or something that everybody, hey, we're sort of informally in agreement to making these changes.
One more question. Go ahead.
We're recording.
Oh, okay, thank you. So along these lines then, would you comment on the AIA's attempt to put together some contractual BIM documentation that would serve the team?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. The E203. I haven't found that the E203 has been attached to many of our contracts to date. We know it's there, we use it, we look at it. But the way that we've been approaching BIM has been that it's an instrument of service to the contracts as they're written now. And providing the contractor the modeling that they need in order to more effectively do pre-construction is providing a good service. And the E202 has an LOD chart in there, and BIM can be sometimes understood as bureaucracy information management. And that's just not that, and I don't want to be vicious about the AIA because they've also done really great things for us, and I could list those out as well. But I don't find that the E202 itself is as useful as it could be. Mm-hmm.
Just to clarify, you said E202 and 203?
Is it the 202 or just the 203?
It may be both.
Okay, I think they might have updated it, right?
They have a few, and I think there may be even a G something.
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah, right.
If you look up the BIM documents, most likely you'll be able to find them.
Mm-hmm.
And they are being sometimes quoted, especially by government projects.
And we still do that waiver. Sorry.
We do
It's okay.
too.
Oh no.
Any final questions or comments from the audience before we wrap up? No. Well, thank you both so much for coming from Richmond.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.